everyone, thanks for coming to the second night of the James Connolly Festival here in the new theatre, Connolly Books. Today's discussion is going to be on Chinese Socialism, what it means in the 21st century. And we have with us today Carlos Martinez. Carlos is a coordinator of the Friends of Socialist China. He's written an awful lot about China, socialism with Chinese characteristics, what the People's Republic of China is like in the world today, what its domestic policies are, and so on. Carlos has written a book called The East is Still Red, which is a book that interrogates a lot of the questions about China. Specifically, what is it like to be a communist party in power in the world today? What are the challenges, but also what are the successes? The book offers up a number of fairly interesting answers to particularly the Western-centric leftist understandings of China. The book is available in Connolly Books if anyone wants to buy it, and I'm sure if someone wants to get a signed copy of it, Carlos will oblige. And Carlos is also the co-writer with Keith Bennett, or co-editor, with Keith Bennett of People's China at 75, which, as you can imagine, is a look at China today as it relates 75 years since the formation of the People's Republic. So you're not here to listen to me, so I'll pass you on to Carlos, who will give us a fairly comprehensive overview of the People's Republic, and once we're done that, we'll have a bit of a Q&A and maybe a conversation afterwards. So, Carlos?
Okay, thank you very much, Graham. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out this evening. I haven't been given a particularly tight or strict remit. I've been asked to talk for some amount of time about Chinese socialism in the 21st century. And, well, the first thing we kind of had to clear up is what China and socialism have to do with each other these days. In as much as one hears those two words in the same sentence, it's usually something along the lines of, well, China used to be socialist, but it's not socialist anymore. But, we're supposed to be talking about Chinese socialism in the 21st century, not Chinese socialism in the 20th century. And you can go to China, and you can go to Beijing, you can go to Shanghai, and one of the first things that you're going to see is Starbucks or KFC or McDonald's, a bunch of things that I kind of think that once we seize power, once we have our own socialist revolution, on day one we're probably going to get rid of Starbucks and KFC and McDonald's. But they've got them. They've also got billionaires. They've got very wealthy people who own and deploy capital. You would have to call them capitalists on that basis. They make profits on the basis of extracting surplus value. There's private capital. There's stark inequality in China. So these are things that we would tend to associate not with socialism, but with capitalism. But then it's also important to recognize that if China is a capitalist country, it's a quite unusual type of capitalist country. There are a few characteristics that make it really quite significantly different to what we experience in the West, in the advanced capitalist countries. The most obvious one being the incredible resource and the incredible energy and the incredible amount of time and money that's gone into alleviating poverty and making people's lives better. China's anti-poverty campaign has been described by the United Nations as the most rapid decline in absolute poverty ever witnessed. And they achieved in 2021 what they call their first centenary goal, which was to eliminate extreme poverty by the centenary of the founding of the Communist Party of China. The CPC was founded in 1921, and they met this goal in 2021. So that's 1.4 billion people in China that are out of extreme poverty, and that means more than just whatever the World Bank international definition of the poverty line is. That doesn't just mean that everyone has more than $2.10 a day to spend on things, as income. It also means 7 guarantees, and the 7 guarantees are: you've got access to secure and dignified housing, so you've got a roof over your head. You've got food on the table. You've got a nutritious and adequate diet. You've got clothing. Your children have the right to 10 years free, universal, mandatory education. So your children go to school. You've got access to healthcare. So you get ill, you get malaria. Actually, malaria is a bad example because they've eliminated malaria as well. But you get TB, and you can go to a medical clinic, or a doctor will come to your home and you'll be treated for that. You're not going to die of it. And number 6 is you've got clean, improved running water piped into your home. And finally, you've got access to modern energy. So you've got gas and or electricity available in your home. And you've got the basic minimum income level of at least $2.10 a day, which I appreciate in Temple Bar doesn't go very far, but I suspect won't buy you even a half a pint. But in rural China can at least get you, a couple of decent meals. So this is that's a pretty incredible achievement for a developing country of 1.4 billion people in Asia that has been, not so long ago, was one of the poorest countries in the world. If you go to India, where my dad is from, or you go to Pakistan or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or Myanmar or Thailand or wherever, if you've got those 7 things, if your kids go to school and you've got secure housing and you're not in debt, you're not in intergenerational debt bondage, and you can get medical treatment when you get sick, etc. You've got electricity in your home. That's basically the definition of middle class. You're doing pretty well in rural India if you can say those things. So what they've achieved in that regard and the resources they've put into it is unprecedented and really remarkable, and is not what you would expect of a capitalist country. It feels more socialist than it feels capitalist. The problem of homelessness has basically been solved in China, and on my walk from Motel 1 to this theatre, I can see that the problem of homelessness has not been solved in Dublin. It certainly hasn't been in London, where I live. It certainly hasn't been in the United States or anywhere in Europe. China's done more than any other country in relation to environmental protection, in relation to green, sustainable development. China's responsible for 60% of all renewable energy production worldwide. It's responsible for 98% of the world's electric buses, 70% of the world's high-speed rail. It's coal has gone from over 80% in its power mix to under 50% now, and declining fast. Its forest coverage has gone from 12% a few decades ago to 24% now, so it's doubled. Pollution, 15, 20 years ago, if you looked at the list of the top 20 most polluted cities in the world, nearly all of them were in China. Now, none of them are in China. It's world leading in electric vehicles, it's world leading in biodiversity protection. In relation to COVID-19, maybe it feels like a long time ago now, but it wasn't a long time ago. Obviously, the coverage of China's management of COVID-19 was that it was incredibly repressive, it was incredibly authoritarian, etc., etc. But the fact is that with very strict short-term lockdowns and the plunging of huge resources into protecting people's lives, they were able to achieve a death rate of about 1% of what we had in Britain, what we had in the United States. So all of these feel like more socialist things than they do capitalist things. They're examples of where resources are being ploughed into protecting human life rather than creating private profit or augmenting shareholder value. And if going back to 1949 and the founding of the People's Republic, if you look at the achievements in those 75, 76 years, life expectancy was in the early 30s. Now it's 79, like it's up there with the advanced capitalist countries. It's actually surpassed that of the United States now, very sadly. Life expectancy in the United States is in decline. And it's also interesting, I just realized when I was thinking about this today, 79 life expectancy is the highest that's ever been achieved by a socialist country, a country that defines itself in its constitution as being socialist, a country that's run by a communist party. So, that's an interesting thing to consider. Obviously, feudalism has been comprehensively dismantled, which it hasn't been almost anywhere else in Asia. That means that the rural class system has been abolished. Land has been distributed to the peasantry, and it's also meant, along with that, an unprecedented shift in the role of women. Like the status of women now compared to what it was before the Chinese Revolution, it's night and day. And there are lots of criticisms that can be made and that are made of the status of women in Chinese society today. Some of them legitimate, some of them less legitimate, but there's no doubt, and actually, the former Venezuelan ambassador to Britain, and before that she was ambassador in China for 9 or 10 years, Rocio Maneiro, she was responding to a question about why there are so few women in the top echelons of Chinese, the Chinese body politic, in the Politburo, in the Central Committee, etc. And she said, listen, Chinese women are the free women of Asia. Yes, they're not well represented in the Politburo. Yes, they're not represented in the Central Committee. And that's a problem that the government knows about and is seeking to address. However, Chinese women hold themselves with pride. They consider themselves and are treated as the equal of men. They're well represented in politics, in business, in science, in technology, even in academia, in the military. And furthermore, they don't suffer the type of problems that British women suffer. They don't have a gender pay gap in China. Furthermore, I was talking with Garode about this earlier, women in China enjoy a level of kind of personal safety that women in the West can only dream of. You can be out in Shanghai or Xi'an or Guangzhou or Beijing at 2 in the morning as a woman and not worry about being attacked and abused. The literacy rate in China is essentially 100% and well ahead of that of the United States. Education has, China's education is increasingly the envy of the world. Chinese school students, generally speaking, at a far higher level, particularly in the STEM subjects, than their counterparts in the West. And Chinese top universities, Tsinghua, Renmin University, Fudan universities, increasingly these are among the best, the most prestigious educational institutions in the world. And we're talking about a country that was, in science and technology terms, one of the most backward countries in the world, which is now a science and technology powerhouse that is world leading in telecommunications, in space exploration, in quantum computing, in supercomputing, in renewable energy, in electric vehicles, and so on, to such a degree that Samir Amin, the well-known Marxist economist, Egyptian, who died a couple of years ago, described China as the only truly emergent country. There's lots of talk about emerging economies. He says that China is the only country that, outside of the imperialist world system, as a developing country, has successfully been able to break the chains of underdevelopment. The other thing that's very different about China compared to the advanced capitalist countries in Northern America, Western Europe and Japan, is that it has a profoundly different relationship with the world at large. China's about the same size economically as the United States. In GDP terms, it's a bit smaller and will overtake the United States in a few years' time. In purchasing power parity terms, it's a little bit bigger than the United States and overtook it a few years ago. But essentially speaking, for our purposes, they're about the same size economically. But China has a deeply different foreign policy to that of the United States. If you look at their military posture and their power projection worldwide, the United States has this whole global infrastructure with 800 foreign military bases, with NATO and the Quad and AUKUS and its RIMPAC exercises. It has literally hundreds of thousands of troops deployed, from Britain to Germany to South Korea to Japan to Okinawa to Guam to Australia to the Philippines, and it's got weapons deployed, including nuclear weapons, ready to be used all around the world. And aside from all of that, it engages in destabilization, it engages in proxy wars, it engages in unilateral sanctions, it engages in coups, it engages in assassinations, it engages in economic coercion around the world. None of these things China does. There's assorted criticisms that one can make of China's foreign policy. Lots of criticisms are made, some in good faith, some in bad faith. It occurred to me earlier that one common criticism of China's foreign policy is that it lures countries of the global south, the countries of Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean and the Pacific, into debt traps. And the politicians that make these accusations are, of course, from countries like the United States, countries like Britain, and it's a bit ironic, given that the West's kind of post-colonial relationship with the global South is characterized precisely by that of being a debt trap. That these people want to accuse China of laying debt traps, and you've got the likes of Hillary Clinton or Marco Rubio or Rex Tillerson kind of fretting about the possibilities of Chinese colonialism. And of course, we see all these scare stories about China's bad behavior abroad, and generally speaking, they turn out to be ridiculous media, just anti-China media hype. You probably remember a year or two ago there was this story about Chinese companies allegedly taking over an airport in Kampala in Uganda because the Ugandans hadn't paid their debts on time. And this was like front page news of all the major newspapers. About a week later, it was maybe page 18 news. A little correction. So actually that wasn't true. In terms of debt trap, well, Debt Justice UK, very well-known and prestigious charity, has stated that Chinese loans to global south countries typically have an interest rate of around 50% of those of the IMF, the World Bank, and the Western multilateral institutions. And furthermore, Chinese companies typically show far greater flexibility in terms of repayment and in terms of debt relief. For example, Sri Lanka, when Sri Lanka declared sovereign default in April 2022, Beijing was the first country to restructure its loans to Sri Lanka. Another very important thing to mention, that's kind of pretty foundational, yes, China engages in commercial activities, China invests money, China lends, China's involved in infrastructure construction and various partnership projects around the world. But none of that is backed up with any kind of military heft. You've got this famous sentence of the New York Times journalist, very right-wing journalist, Thomas Friedman, where he said something very profound, very insightful, that there's no McDonald's without McDonald's. There's no McDonald's without McDonnell Douglas. And American economic supremacy has behind it, a mailed fist. You can't say that, there's no equivalent of that in relation to China or Chinese companies. You can't say that there's no Huawei without the People's Liberation Army. And a big part of that is China not doing to others what was done to it. The Chinese have got a pretty strong historical memory. The Chinese suffered terribly in what they call the century of humiliation, starting with the Opium Wars, which were waged by Britain. A war waged specifically for the right to be able to impose opium on the Chinese people, and in winning which, their terms of abuse, their terms of victory, their war indemnity was a set of unequal treaties, was the right to have foreign concessions in Shanghai, the right to have foreign concessions in Guangzhou, and obviously stealing Hong Kong. So, as President Xi Jinping has said, China will neither tread the old path of colonization and plunder nor the crooked path taken by some countries to seek hegemony once they grow strong. And you can look at the reality of China's engagement with the countries of the global south. The Belt and Road Initiative is, right now providing the countries of Africa, of Asia, of Latin America, of the Caribbean, of the Middle East, of the Pacific, with the opportunity to modernize, to break those chains of underdevelopment. Within that framework of the Belt and Road Initiative, railways are being built, schools are being built, hospitals are being built, ports, factories, airports, roads are being built. With Chinese finance, with Chinese support, Ethiopia a few years ago launched the first metro train system in sub-Saharan Africa. Again, with Chinese finance and support, Bolivia, which is the poorest country in South America, launched its first telecom satellite, which actually provides connectivity, 4G, 5G telephone signals to the whole country. In terms of renewable energy, China's involved in renewable energy projects with countries throughout the global south, such that a lot of countries increasingly have the opportunity to leapfrog the fossil fuel stage of development. I mean, China's investment and innovation in renewable energy has been such that the cost of wind power and solar power has diminished by about 80% in the last 10 years. So that now if you're in Malawi or if you're in Botswana and you're looking to build a power station, the economically sensible thing to do is to build a solar power station. And China's got a big role in all of that. China, Cuba, people here would know that Cuba's having terrible problems with its power grid and with its energy supply. China is currently cooperating with Cuba to build 100 solar power stations on the island. The Forum on China-Africa Cooperation last year in Beijing announced that China would unilaterally give all the least developing countries, over 30 of which are in Africa, zero tariff market access for all product lines, making China the first major country to take that step. And in a time in which tariffs are kind of hot news at the moment, where certain countries are imposing new tariffs left, right and centre, it's a very interesting and useful contrast. So, those are some of the ways in which China is really quite different to the United States, really quite different to the European Union, really quite different to Canada, to Britain, to Japan. Why is China different? What makes China different? The first thing to say is that, yes, China is a market economy, but the state dominates the economy. Even private economic activity is heavily regulated, is subject to China's 5-year plans. The commanding heights of the economy are state-owned, so heavy industry, energy, transport, communications, foreign trade are in public hands. Finance is in public hands, so the 4 big banks in China are all state-owned, and that means that investment decisions, what to invest in order to encourage the overall development of the economy, those decisions are made by the government, a government which is accountable not to shareholders, but to its population. It means, the fact that finance is state-owned means that capital isn't able to seize control of the overall economic course. And in general, there's a huge amount of regulation, there's a huge amount of oversight of private capital. Capital is allowed to flourish to the degree that it helps with the economic development of the whole country and serves the greater class interests of the population, and particularly the working class and the peasantry. Land is publicly owned in China, so the rural population all has land. Even if you've got nothing else in the villages, you've got your own home, you don't have debt, and you can grow your own food. And what all of those economic factors come down to is a political question, which is the location of political power. A few of you have probably seen John Pilger's documentary, The Coming War on China. Very interesting, very useful documentary. Would strongly recommend people to watch it if you haven't done. And there's a very nice clip of an interview with a guy called Eric Lee, who's a Shanghai-based, I think he's a venture capitalist, but he's also, he's a geopolitical analyst. And he makes an interesting point, because John Pilger puts it to him, well, I'm here in Shanghai and I can see Starbucks and all the rest of it, and I can see that there's some very rich people and I can see that there are some significantly poorer people, so what's the difference between this and a capitalist country? And Eric Lee kind of puts it in very simple but I think quite powerful terms. He says, yeah, China's a thriving market economy and we've got billionaires, we've got capitalists in China, but they don't tell the government what to do. The government tells them what to do. And that's the opposite of what you've got in a country like the United States, where capital has enshrined rights and where, to all intents and purposes, the billionaires do tell the government what to do. In China, the capitalist class is literally not allowed legally to organize as a class. You couldn't have a political party in China that was a capitalist political party that aimed to restore capitalism or that aimed to represent the class interests of capitalism, which is a profoundly different phenomenon to capitalist countries, right? And that's why, because of that location of political power in ordinary people, that's why China is able to dedicate the resources that it dedicates to meeting the needs of ordinary people and preserving the environment. That is why it's possible in China for profits to be secondary to human life. And you can see that in foreign policy as well. Like, why doesn't China follow the same foreign policy as the US, as Britain, as the EU, as Japan? It's because the state doesn't represent monopoly capitalism. Why do governments and armed forces of the imperialist countries act in the way they do? Why did Britain and the United States wage war in Iraq from 2003 and carry out an occupation of several years? In the process, killing upwards of 1 million civilians. They didn't do it in my interests. I don't think they did it in your interests. I don't think they did it in the interests of working class people in the United States of America. They were representing the interests of the big oil companies, right? They were representing the interests of monopoly capitalism. China doesn't go to war. You can't. The fossil fuel lobby can't tell the Chinese state and the Chinese armed forces to wage war on its behalf. The military-industrial complex in China can't tell the Chinese state to wage war on its behalf. Apart from anything else, both of those sectors are state-owned in China. So China follows a very different foreign policy. It follows a multipolar strategy which serves China's interests and it serves the overall vision of the Chinese Communist Party. It's a vision that includes sovereignty for the countries of the world, because sovereignty means freedom for people to choose their own development path, free from hegemonism, free from bullying, free from domination. And when countries have got the freedom to choose their own development path, generally speaking, they'll tend to choose something along the lines of socialism, or at least a socialist-oriented type of development path. Multipolarity means equality in international relations. It means an end to bullying. It means an end to the constant threat of war, which China suffers from. China suffered from bullying. China suffers from the constant threat of war. Peace is the best environment to pursue mutually beneficial cooperation between all countries. And again, to quote Xi Jinping, without peace, nothing is possible. Maintaining peace is our greatest common interest and the most cherished aspiration of the people of all countries. Not something that Donald Trump says. Coming back to the 21st century, what can we expect of Chinese socialism in the 21st century? So we talked before about China's first centenary goal, the elimination of extreme poverty by 2021. They also have a second centenary goal, which is by 2049, which is going to be the centenary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, to build a great modern socialist country that is prosperous, strong, democratic, culturally advanced, harmonious, and beautiful. Sounds great. It could mean a lot of things, and I'll just dig in quickly to a few of those characteristics. What does it mean to say it's going to be prosperous? It means that China's going to continue pursuing modernization. It's going to mean having a per capita GDP similar to that of the advanced countries. I think China's per capita GDP at the moment is around 15,000 euros. The aim is to have a per capita GDP more like that of Spain or France. It means deepening industrialization. It means moving on from tackling extreme poverty to tackling relative poverty and massively reducing the inequality that's built up in China over the course of the last 30, 40 years. And doing all of this within a framework of socialism, within a framework of what they call common prosperity, where the fruits of production and progress and modernization are shared by everybody and not dominated by the wealthy. What the Communist Party says is that China's modernization is the modernization of common prosperity for all. And it's also a prosperity that's reached without destroying the environment, that's reached without recourse to domination, war, hegemony, imperialism, without engaging in coercion, without engaging or participating in the system of unequal exchange that characterizes modern imperialism. And this is, of course, profoundly different to the West's path to modernization, which owes so much to colonialism, so much to imperialism, so much to unequal exchange. What does it mean to be a modern socialist country that's beautiful? Well, that's a reference to protecting and preserving the environment. China's got its two major targets that it announced a few years ago. First, to reach peak carbon emissions by 2030. The second, to get to zero emissions or net zero by 2060. All credible analysis reveals that they've already reached the peak carbon target several years ahead of target. And the idea of getting to net zero is built into every layer of economic policy making in China. And I'm sure they'll also reach that target well ahead of time. I already mentioned that China is clearly the world's only renewable energy superpower, responsible for 60% of all wind power production, responsible for 60% of all solar power production. It's leading the way in nuclear fusion, it's leading the way in electric vehicles, it's leading the way in electric buses, high-speed rail, it's leading the way in afforestation, in pollution, in biodiversity protection. So that's what it means to have a great modern socialist country that's beautiful. Democratic is a pretty interesting word to include in that goal as well, because we in the West don't tend to think of China as being democratic, because of course we've defined democracy in the West. Democracy means the Westminster parliamentary system where you can choose between two parties, both of which represent the interests of the elite, the capitalist class, the billionaires, the 1%. China does have its own system of what it calls whole process people's democracy, based around national people's congresses, which operate at the national level, the provincial level, the town level, the village level, and in the workplace. And alongside that, the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. All of those have elections at every level. All of those engage in extensive consultation. And in many ways, I would say, are far more democratic than what we experience in the West in capitalist countries. It's funny, I remember the first time I was in China, in Beijing, in 2019, I was having a conversation with someone at the Chinese Academy of Marxism, and this was during Trump's first term. And she was explaining China's democracy, and she said, look, the difference is that China's democracy isn't a money democracy. You can't just throw a few $1 billion into the project and get elected. If you want to be in China's Politburo, or the standing committee of the Politburo, you have to have a record of 20, 30 years representing people's interests, making the lives of literally tens of millions of people better. Without that, there's no way that you can get into the top echelons of Chinese politics. She said someone like Donald Trump in China, he couldn't be a village prefect, never mind president of the country. But China does have a vision of enhancing and improving its democracy. It does see it very much as a work in progress. They're experimenting with encouraging grassroots participation, increasing workplace democracy, increasing community organisation and engagement. And actually, Karon was with me on a delegation to China a couple of years ago, where we saw a kind of experimental grassroots democracy village or community of about 10,000 people in Guizhou, where they've introduced all sorts of concepts around self-organizing with an elected committee. So you've got kind of volunteer groups that manage the library, that manage social activities, that manage cultural activities. You've got QR codes everywhere, so where you can give feedback and make complaints, etc., etc. And it's being done in the way that things generally are done in China, which is on an experimental basis. They'll conduct an experiment like that in 100 different villages around the country. They'll correlate the results, they'll analyze it, they'll compare experiences, and if it's considered to be a success, then they'll roll it out in more and more places until such a point that it's like a nationwide system. What do they mean by becoming a great modern socialist country that's strong? That is a reference to China having the ability to defend itself from aggression and defend itself from counter-revolution. China wants peace. China wants peaceful coexistence with the countries of the world, and obviously it wants peaceful coexistence with the imperialist countries, particularly the United States, which, although it may be in declining, it may be a waning economic power, but it's still by far the only military superpower, and has this global infrastructure of power projection that I talked about earlier. So China wants peaceful coexistence, but it faces an escalating campaign of containment and encirclement with bases, with troops, with weapons. And its its military modernization is essential to impede or to prevent long-term plans that are spearheaded by the US to wage war on China, to end the rule of the Communist Party, to dismantle socialism, to break off, Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, Qinghai, Inner Mongolia, etc., as separate states, to install a comprador capitalist government in Beijing that's willing to play nice, that's willing to go along with the Washington consensus. So, as far as China's concerned, it has to be strong enough militarily to prevent that sort of plan from being enacted. So that's hopefully a little bit of substance or a bit of meat on the bones of China's second centenary goal of building a great modern socialist country that's prosperous, strong, democratic, culturally advanced, harmonious and beautiful. And 2049 is only 24 years away. I'm sort of vaguely hopeful that I'll still be alive, and I'm excited to see what it looks like. Thanks very much.
Thanks a million, Carlos. That was very comprehensive. I think you touched on a lot of different points. One point I would add myself would be, if you want to look at my view of China's role in the world, I visited the Lao People's Democratic Republic last year, which tends to be the most forgotten, still actually existing socialist country. But I think if you want to look at the difference between socialism and imperialism, I think Lao is a very good example. Under the US assault and terrorism against Laos and against Vietnam and against Cambodia in the 60s and 70s, Laos is today even still per capita the most bombed country in the world. There are still people dying, even children dying every year from unexploded ordnance littered around Laos that were dropped by American bombs. China has played a very different role in Laos, particularly in the past couple of years. China has built a huge infrastructure project where they built a massive high-speed rail which connects Laos with the Chinese transport grid and will connect Laos with countries like Thailand, Malaysia and Vietnam, which particularly for Laos as a landlocked country is very important. And the Chinese, through their own financing, cleared the unexploded ordnance. They gave Laos a vital boost to its economy. They also built the largest hospital in Laos for free. And they also have built schools and everything. So I think if you want to look at the difference between socialism, which in the case of China and Laos, means building hospitals, building infrastructure, improving people's livelihoods, eradicating illiteracy, and imperialism, which equals, in its most naked form, the United States bombing a country which has lower population than Ireland into smithereens. So that, for me, I think is a very important challenge to the notion that China is a form of neo-imperialism or neo-colonialism, just with a different flag. But I think if we want to have an audience discussion or a Q&A, if people have any questions for Carlos or points they want to make and so on, if you want to put up your hand.
So thanks for that. That was really interesting. My question is basically about so China. It's focused on manufacturing. It's focused on people out of poverty. It's really focused on on building trade alliances with Africa. So it's really focused on the fundamentals. But America, obviously, is imperial power, has projected soft power across the world through entertainment or NGOs. Like USAID and, obviously the military bases, obviously that's more hard power. But do you think China is going to be forced, China has very much, it seems from the outside, have like a viewpoint is that we're focused on ourselves. And, this is sometimes being maligned as being isolationist, but really it's just they're not an imperial power, Do you think that to prevent an upcoming conflict that and in the face of what will surely be a propaganda war against them, they will have to engage in this kind of soft power tactics?
Do you want to answer that now, or will we take one?
I don't mind either way.
Yeah, answer now.
Okay. Yes, it's a really interesting question. And we just had this announcement from Donald Trump that they're going to impose 100% tariffs on foreign films or foreign-made films in the United States. And I think that probably reflects to some degree that kind of global cultural hegemony that the US has enjoyed for so long is breaking down a little bit. And you can also see that with things like the attack on TikTok and this sudden massive migration of millions of Americans to the Xiaohongshu, the Little Red Book app in China. I think, US soft power and cultural hegemony's got a very specific history, and it's used it very purposefully over the course of a century, right? Especially Hollywood and even music. We have this disgusting irony and hypocrisy that while at a time in the US where racial segregation still existed, they were sending African American jazz bands around the world to promote a vision of how free the United States is. Look how free we are. We have this incredibly free music, that's performed by the sons and daughters and the grandsons and granddaughters of slaves. That's just how great America is. I think that's breaking down in a few ways. Of course, China would like to project a bit more soft power, and hurdles are going up in the way of that all the time. For example, in Britain, we've had the dismantling of most of the Confucius Institutes on the basis of this mad scare propaganda that Confucius Institutes aren't just teaching Chinese language and showing people about Chinese tea and kung fu and whatnot and Tai Chi. Really, they're engaged in espionage against the British state, and the same is the case in the US. And in general, we're a far cry from the golden age, certainly of Britain-China relations about 10 years ago, when you had Xi Jinping and David Cameron enjoying a nice pint together somewhere in the north of England. But China is developing its domestic film industry, and films like Nerja and the Battle of Lake Chongqing, increasingly they are attracting a Western audience, and I think in general it feels like Chinese technology, things like Little Red Book, are more accessible to Westerners. But there's only so much that's within Chinese power as such. But people's attitudes towards China are shifting, and I think they're shifting for a couple of key reasons. Probably the most important right now is Palestine. People have lost so much faith and so much kind of respect for their own governments and for the whole democratic system in the West that they can see a genocide is happening in Gaza. They can see it on TikTok, on social media. They're waking up and looking on their phones and seeing something that's clearly a genocide, but their governments are telling them and their journalists are telling them that no, it's not a genocide. And the Keir Starmers and the Donald Trumps and the Kamala Harrises and the Joe Bidens are supporting this, and they're saying that Israel's got a right to do what it's doing. Keir Starmer, supposedly left-wing progressive prime minister in Britain, even went on record saying that he thought that the Israelis do have a right to cut off water and electricity to the 2.2 million people in Gaza. So people have become extremely disillusioned in the political system here, and they're looking at what's happening elsewhere, and they're seeing that China has a very different position, that it has called for a ceasefire, a unilateral and comprehensive, unconditional ceasefire from day one. It has called for an end to the violence. It has been working with the Palestinian freedom movement and with the different groups. There was the Beijing Declaration a few months ago where the leadership of 14 main resistance groups, national liberation groups in Palestine, went to Beijing and signed a unity agreement about what your post-conflict governance looks like in Gaza. So I think that's one way in which people can see that China is behaving far better than Western governments, is behaving in a way that's far more consistent with what people would want from their governments. The other thing is around renewable energy. I mentioned in my presentation that China is responsible for 60% of all renewable energy production. I think young people especially are quite tuned into the need to cut out fossil fuels and to cut out carbon emissions. And they've heard lots of promises from their governments, and they've seen lots of backtracking and reneging from their governments and from private industry, and they can see that the fossil fuel lobby has a huge amount of unwarranted power in their countries, and they can see that in China things are very different. So in a sense, I think China is developing its soft power through its overall political posture and through its rise, which is increasingly impossible to ignore. Like the environmental movement, typically in Britain at least, it tends to be pretty liberal, pretty middle class, and basically pretty anti-communist and certainly anti-China. But we're at a point now where organisations like Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth and whatnot, they can't actually ignore what China is doing. At this point, if you're interested in saving the planet, and if you're interested in preventing climate breakdown, you have to recognise that, well, thank God for China, thank God they're doing what they're doing. Otherwise, we really would be in a disastrous situation. So, I think that situation of global cultural hegemony is shifting. It's shifting pretty slowly, but it's perfectly possible that quantity will turn into quality in the coming few years.
So we're seeing a rise in inter-imperialist violence and war across the world at the moment. Do you see kind of some of these powers trying to align with China out of a sense of desperation in the future? And if so, which ones do you think will join BRICS first?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. In a sense, and there's a lot of different views on this. There's a significant portion of the left that thinks that there basically isn't any inter-imperialist rival these days, that we're in a stage of super-imperialism or hyper-imperialism, which is consolidated around the US, and it's consolidated around dollar hegemony, and it's consolidated around Wall Street and the whole NATO system, basically. more or less what emerged in the aftermath of World War II as a response to the Soviet Union and the emergence of a socialist camp. There was a recognition that the United States was by far the strongest economic and military power, and that if the countries of Europe in particular and Japan wanted to maintain their capitalist system and wanted to join a kind of global united front against the socialist world, it would have to be on the basis of US domination on it and accepting and acceding to US leadership. And that's never been completely uncomplicated, and France and Germany have always had their problems with US power and have always attempted, or sometimes attempted, to assert some strategic autonomy, to use de Gaulle's famous phrase, probably observed more in the breach. But yeah, there's a lot of people that feel that we're still basically in that era where there isn't any meaningful inter-imperialist rivalry. What you've got is consolidation of the imperialist world under the leadership of the United States. And that was in the period of the Cold War, that was targeted primarily at the USSR, and in the period of the new Cold War and the period of encirclement and containment of China, it's obviously targeted predominantly at the People's Republic of China. I think that's probably, that analysis is a bit simplistic, and I think there are cracks emerging, as we can see now, especially under a Trump administration. The EU is starting to think much more in terms of strategic autonomy, and that's not, it's not a people-centered autonomy, it's imperialist autonomy. The EU increasingly wants to be able to act on its own terms against the global south, against China, and it wants to be able to assert its own interests and be able to see those as separate from the interests of the United States. Similarly with Canada, similarly with Australia. I think, different groups and blocks of imperialists and different imperialist countries would seek to work with China to some degree if they see that being in their interests. And I would fully support China leveraging any contradictions between the imperialists to whatever degree it can. That's an absolute must. If you've got the Lenin's three contradictions between labour and capital, between the imperialist world and the oppressed world, and between the imperialist countries themselves, you have to leverage. A revolutionary strategy means leveraging all of those contradictions. And you can basically see China doing that. Trump announces his ridiculous tariffs, like global tariffs, so-called reciprocal tariffs around the world, including like 145% tariffs on China and flat rate 10% tariffs on all countries in the world, including countries that are populated exclusively by penguins. The very next week, Pedro Sanchez, Prime Minister of Spain, is there in Beijing saying we don't want these unilateral tariffs. We want a orderly global trading system led by WTO rules. So I think there are some differences that are emerging there. A couple of weeks later, China organized a trilateral summit between itself, Japan, and South Korea, basically in opposition to US unilateralism and economic coercion and bullying. So I think there are differences, and there are kind of conflicts and contradictions that are emerging between different imperialist groups, and I think some of them, absolutely will try to get some leverage through working with China. And I think mainly that creates space, that creates possibilities for China.
Yeah, more questions. What we'll do is we'll take 3 at a time.
Okay.
Can you manage that? Tommy, yourself, and yourself.
Carlos, do you care to comment on BRICS, please?
And second question? You're right.
Yeah. Just a couple of things. I've been in China twice and travelled into quite a number of cities along the east and south, north cities. And I have to say that there's nothing that Carlos said that I couldn't that I could disagree with. In all the places I travelled to, I saw one homeless person and no beggars. In huge cities, no beggars at all. There's a very comprehensive social security in China, the likes of which has never been seen anywhere. But anyway, I actually have a big question I want to ask, but I have to say another little thing about hegemony. And there is absolutely a creeping Chinese hegemony in all sorts of areas. I'm an engineer, and one of the main things I notice is that they've had a huge series of videos about projects, the underground trains, bridges, etc., all of those things, ports, harbours. And the funny thing is that in the past month or two, I've noticed the Americans creeping back with similar videos, except the projects they are putting forward are really not in the same category at all. And it's not very impressive, and they're wasting their time. But definitely, that sort of thing. But anyway, the question really that I want to ask is this. Again, I'm an engineer, and I know that up to the end of the 18th century, China was the richest country in the world, and well recognized of that. And but the rate of development since 1949 is extraordinary. Now, one thing you need, I estimated just top of my head that they have between 500,000 and 1 million, like 40-story blocks of accommodation in China. Something, that could be out by 250,000, doesn't matter. Now, to actually build one of those, just one of them, requires a huge range of skills. It requires about 10 different types of engineers. It's not just a question of building a huge block. You have to work out how you supply water, how you supply sewage, how you supply roads, transport, everything. It's a vast project even to build one of those, let alone 500,000. Now, I've asked people in China, how in the name of God do they train enough experts? And that's just building. I'm not talking about chemicals and all the other areas, scientific areas, production of all sorts of stuff. You can't just. China has a long tradition of universities, but not on a huge scale until recently. So I don't know how they train these people. Because you can't just train. First of all, you have to train professors, and that takes 20 years. And then it takes just.
Sorry, don't mean to interrupt you.
Yes. But my question is, how in the name of God where did the capital come from for all this development?
Okay, thanks. And there was a third question somewhere around here?
There's obviously been an agenda in the West for anti-Chinese propaganda that I find is starting to kind of dissipate now. I feel like a lot more young people are starting to see a better side of China than what they've been shown before, and they probably appreciate the country more often. But I suppose the question is probably more so out of ignorance than anything else. But when we hear things like the issues with the Uyghur population, Tiananmen Square, Tibet, censorship in China, is there a concern of expression or conformity in China that probably has been exacerbated in the West, but that can't simply be ignored? Is that a concern of how they conduct themselves?
Do you want to take that on?
Yeah, some good questions, some nice difficult questions. That's great. in relation to Tommy's question about the BRICS, I think BRICS, I'm sure people know, was originally BRIC, but so used by a British economist, actually, Jim O'Neill, to describe what were then, in the mid-2000s, like the kind of big emerging economies, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, and a couple of years later, South Africa was added to that. And in the last couple of years, 6 more countries have joined, and it's kind of in the process of expanding. And like it started as a fairly amorphous and ephemeral thing, you know, it's kind of just an idea really, but they've built some structure around it now, to the degree that I would say that BRICS is the key organizing force of the multipolar process. It gathers all the rising global South countries together and sets an agenda and determines what they agree on and what their collective strategy is. And it's not stated, but it's pretty clear that the ultimate objective is to break the stranglehold of US-led imperialism. That's the idea of BRICS. So in kind of Marxist and historical materialist terms, what it means is providing a vehicle to take our world system away from imperialism, away from domination, away from hegemonism, towards a multipolarity and a multipolar system of international relations in which all countries enjoy their sovereignty, all countries are equal, all countries have a voice in the running of global affairs. So on that basis, I think BRICS is extremely important. You know, it's not the only organization of multipolarity. There's also things like the G77, to some degree even the G20. There's also the non-aligned movement. There's also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. There's the big regional blocs such as ASEAN, such as the African Union, such as CELAC. But yeah, I think BRICS has come to acquire a historic role in humanity's journey out of imperialism. So on that basis, I think it's very important and something that we should pay attention to and essentially support. And it's not without its deep contradictions, because the countries in BRICS, even among the founding members of BRICS, have got completely different social systems, completely different ideologies. You know, if you look at just India and China, you know, the 2 biggest countries in the world in population terms, both 1.4 billion people, both you know, Asian countries that got their liberation at about the same time, 1947 in India's case, 1949 in China's case. They've got, you know, a deeply different political orientation, but simply by virtue of being historically oppressed countries, simply by virtue of being non-imperialist countries, simply by virtue of suffering in a system of imperialism and a system of unequal exchange, they have shared interests, and BRICS represents those shared interests at a global scale. So in many ways you could see it as the reassertion of the Bandung Conference back in 1955, the Afro-Asian Conference, when, you know, the newly liberated countries of Africa and Asia got together for the first time, in spite of significant ideological differences, significant political differences, and asserted their collective interests. I think BRICS has a similar role. How on earth does China do what it does? How do they train enough people? You know, how do they train professors? How do they achieve these amazing things? I mean, in a sense, you know, Xi Jinping often says, we take advantage of the socialist system. The socialist system gives us certain advantages that capitalist systems don't have. We can consolidate a level of resource that other countries can't consolidate, that capitalist countries can't consolidate. You know, China decided, let's say 15 years ago, that they wanted to really focus on electric vehicles, and they wanted to be a world leader in electric vehicles. lo and behold, here we are in the this year of our Lord 2025, and China's by far the world leader in electric vehicles. They're increasingly the world leader in telecommunications, in renewable energy, in all of these strategic industries. They've made a decision at the highest level, at the government level, that they're going to invest resources and that they're going to divert resources from these areas to these areas. And on that basis, they can achieve amazing things. You said that even training professors takes 20 years. Well, they've been at it for longer than 20 years. They're conforming to a vision that goes back a long way. And actually, they've been achieving, Chinese socialism has been achieving kind of more or less superhuman things from the very beginning. How did they, in between 1949 and 1953, roll out healthcare and education to the countryside, to 90% of the population? In the space of a few years, to parts of the country which have literally never experienced healthcare, literally never experienced any kind of systematic education. In 1964, so 15 years after the establishment of the PRC, China exploded its first successful nuclear test. So it joined the ranks of the nuclear powers back in 1964, and I appreciate that's a controversial thing, and I, like everyone else, is essentially and fundamentally and ideologically against nuclear weapons. However, nuclear weapons, it has to be said, have served China pretty well over the years, and in its defense, China does have, it is the only nuclear power to have a consistent and from the beginning policy of no first use, such that it's literally written into its constitution that China would only ever use nuclear weapons in retaliation for a nuclear strike by a nuclear power against it. But they did that against all the odds as an extremely poor country in 1964, because it's a socialist country where the working class enjoys a monopoly on political power and where the people can make a decision that this is a strategic priority and they can invest in that. They don't have, we've been talking about, in terms of renewable energy, we've been talking in Britain, we've been talking in the US about the importance of renewable energy for over 30 years, since the Rio summit, right? I think maybe 1992. It's been understood and agreed at the level of international law that this is the problem and this is how we solve it. But we've left that in the hands of the market. We've said, okay, private companies will realize that there's a gap in the market and they'll fill that gap in the market with investment. They haven't done that. Actually, they've let the market run its course, and what the market has come up with is a lot more drilling. It's come up with drill, baby, drill. And actually, the advances that have certainly been made in Britain and the United States, EU has done slightly better, have been basically pretty pathetic. But because China's made it a strategic priority, and because the Chinese government has got so many more levers than capitalist governments have got, they are able to achieve what feel like pretty miraculous things. So, in as much as I've got an answer to that question, I think it's kind of along those lines. In terms of anti-China propaganda and Uyghurs and Hong Kong and Tibet and freedom of speech, etc., I think we're faced with such a barrage of anti-China propaganda, and it's really a propaganda war. And I often say that it's a propaganda war which is about kind of building public support for the potential real war, at the very least the Cold War, and potentially a hot war against China. It's about creating this vision in the public imagination of China as being this awful dystopian place where people have got no freedom and people are really suffering and they just can't wait to get out. And there's a genocide going on in Xinjiang, and people in Hong Kong are denied basic democratic rights, and people aren't allowed to talk their own language in Tibet or in Mongolia, etc. And it's so intense that if you're a friend of China, or if you want to defend China from undue criticism and slander, it can be quite difficult to disambiguate what's valid criticism and what isn't. Clearly, there are valid criticisms that can be made of China. Clearly, it's not a utopia. Clearly, there are lots of things that are wrong and that need to improve. Xinjiang, I've been to Xinjiang a few years ago. Absolutely delightful place, it has to be said. No real signs of genocide. And actually, I thought it was quite impressive, the level to which different communities live alongside each other. And you look at street signs, every single street sign has got Chinese characters and have also got Uyghur script and Kazakh script. And you see newspapers in Uyghur script everywhere. You go into Uyghur-run restaurants and the people there are speaking Uyghur, and they don't serve alcohol and they don't serve pork, which is a big concession because generally speaking, Han Chinese love alcohol and love pork. But and you hear people speaking Uyghur language all the time, and you can see people. You go into parks and people are doing traditional Uyghur or Kazakh dancing, and there's very little evidence of a genocide or indeed a cultural genocide. In fact, there are significant attempts to promote Uyghur language, just as there are significant attempts to promote Tibetan language. Every child in Tibet, whether of Tibetan ancestry or not, learns the Tibetan language. Every child in Xinjiang, whether of Uyghur ancestry or not, learns the Uyghur language. So actually, China takes pride in its nationalities policy, which to a significant degree was kind of inherited and adapted and developed from the Soviet nationalities policy of the 1920s, which blazed a trail for the whole of the socialist world and indeed of humanity, where Soviet academics were creating scripts for minority languages that didn't have scripts prior to that. But can I put my hand on my heart and say, well, there's no discrimination against Uyghur people in Xinjiang, and there's no ethnic profiling, or the Uyghur people never suffer mistreatment at the hand of the police, etc., etc. Clearly, I can't say that, and I wouldn't say that. Clearly, there is some level of problem. I would say that living in London, London has a far worse problem of racism and abuse of ethnic minorities and racial profiling than Xinjiang does. But that's not to say that there isn't any problem and that one can't make any criticism. With freedom of speech, I mean, the idea of China as this deeply authoritarian kind of police state. Graham's spent lots of time in China, other people here have been to China. It certainly doesn't feel like a police state. It's actually pretty rare to even see a police officer on the streets of Beijing or Xi'an or Guangzhou or whatever. When you do see them, they're very well liked. They're helping people out. There's people say what they want, and people publish what they want. There's lots of private newspapers. Obviously, people have got their blogs. People say what they want on Weibo and on WeChat and all the rest of it. So I don't think there's drastic, oppression in terms of freedom of speech. Certainly, the government keeps tabs on things, and as I said previously, the capitalist class is free to be capitalist and to make lots of money and to exploit human labour, but it's not free to organise a capitalist class. And so, where the government does kind of catch whiff of people trying to liaise with US or with the CIA or with USAID around kind of subversion and destabilization projects, it cracks down on that pretty quickly. And in my view, in a context of a hostile imperialist world, where socialist countries have to defend themselves from peaceful evolution or indeed violent counter-revolution, I think that's perfectly justifiable. But clearly there isn't a blanket freedom of speech, but nor is China, this kind of crazy authoritarian place and repressive place where people can't speak their minds. People do speak their minds all the time. Was that the three? That was the three.
Yeah, we'll take two more. Chance first, and number two, Kruba.
So I think the type of talks that you gave tonight and books like your own are very important. particularly if you said to them, most of my generation in Ireland, you would tell them that they could, there's a place, another way is not only possible but already exists on earth. There's another country where most people in my generation own their own home, where they have the 7 guarantees, as you say, to education, healthcare. Most people have good jobs and all that, and they also have consumer items, better smartphones, social networks than a lot of the places in the West. So I think it's very important like that to kind of control the discourse, and you say avoid the coming third world war, another hot war, cold war, whatever. But also to show people that another way is possible. But I'm kind of talking there, I suppose, about the general public. But for the likes of, in a room like this, I suppose for the most part, you're probably preaching to the choir. So for people who are already socialists, communists, republicans, people of the left in Ireland, where we don't have state power and we're probably not anywhere close to a revolution, other than kind of using China as an example, is there any lessons, or in your opinion, was the most lesson that we can learn to actually implement, to organise, and to maybe achieving something like what they have in the future?
Yeah, so my question is, as a communist, your thought international solidarity to other communists around the world is something that is the most important thing that you could do. So based on that, I have a question on Chinese foreign policy. Like the CPI Maoists in India termed China as a social imperialist, and Chinese, I read a report saying the Chinese ambassador even offered help to the Indian state on cracking down with their Maoist problem. At the same time, there was reports saying that the Chinese government sold weapons to the Philippines. Apparently, the Philippines government is in a war against the Communist Party of Philippines Maoists. There was also similar reports saying the Chinese government also offered help to the former Nepalese government to crack down on their Maoist problems. At the same time, you also mentioned that the Chinese government is helping Cuba with building 100 solar power plants. We had a Cuban comrade a few weeks ago in Connolly Books, and one of the points that she told me that the Chinese government doesn't help the Cuban people out of goodwill or international solidarity, but from a business point of view. So my question is, as China is gaining in power, will its foreign policy change mainly from a business point of view to an era of international solidarity, the thing that the Communist parties must be doing if it has power? That's my question.
Yeah, 2 more good, difficult questions. No easy evening for me tonight. So the commentator said, other than using China as an example, other things that we can learn from China. That's a difficult one. I tend to think that holding up, showing people the reality of China and projecting its example does have its own importance, because at the end of the day, we're socialists, we're communists, we're Marxists, and a very important part of that is persuading other people that socialism is a good thing. And a very important part of that today is countering media lies and opposing the propaganda war on China, because if China's, there's 2 kind of bourgeois portrayals of China, basically. One is that it's this dystopia where life is just awful and there's no freedom and everyone wants to get out. And it's this incredibly repressive, evil place. The other is that it's doing great, and that it's getting richer and all the rest of it, and Chinese people are living better. But the reason for that is because they got rid of socialism and turned it capitalist. Mao died in 1976. Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1978, introduced economic reforms, got rid of socialism, dismantled all public property, installed capitalism, and China's been doing great ever since. It was a basket case before, and now it's thriving. So either of those bourgeois narratives, to me, is apart from being untrue, are very unhelpful for our cause in terms of trying to promote the ideas of socialism, the ideas of communism, the ideas of Marxism. You look at China and you say, okay, here's a country that's lifted 800 million people out of poverty and that's blazing a trail in terms of renewable energy, that handles COVID better than any other country in the world, that's become a science and technology superpower and all the rest of it. If it's been able to do that under capitalism, then we've got a pretty serious problem. We actually need to look back at first principles. I always thought that capitalism couldn't do those things. If capitalism can do all of those things, and in spite of increasing inequality, the level at the bottom continues to go up, and that everybody, working class people and the poorest levels of society continue to live better. What the bloody hell are we socialists for? What the bloody hell are we communists for? So, presenting China's successes and explaining how their successes specifically of socialism, I think actually is a pretty important part of our propaganda work as communists in the West. And it's basically why I focus to the extent that I do on China. I like China, I've been to China a few times. I like green tea and Chinese history and Tai Chi as much as the next guy. But ultimately, what interests me about China politically is what it's been able to achieve with a socialist system, with what socialism with Chinese characteristics has been able to achieve. In terms of what's transferable to a modern, pretty advanced capitalist country like Ireland or Britain, I think socialism here is going to look substantially different to what it looks like in China, and our journey to socialism is going to look a lot different to how the Chinese Revolution looked. We're talking about countries that are already advanced and that don't have a peasant majority. In Britain's case, that haven't suffered centuries of colonial domination and humiliation. Obviously, that we can't say that for Ireland. Sorry about that. Wearing my British hat. But I do think the example of China as now, the longest running socialist country. China, the People's Republic of China, has outlived the lifespan of the Soviet Union and the Eastern European people's democracies, and what is by now, the most advanced and developed and modernized socialist country in history, and that is really kind of the core of an emerging and a renascent socialist world. I think, that example does have significant kind of propaganda and organizing value here, in the West, in the belly of the beast. Is China's foreign policy social imperialist? We've got how long?
Not long enough.
Yeah, I mean, this is, kind of going to go back on myself a little bit and retrace some of my footsteps, but there's clearly, there's problems in terms of China's foreign policy, and there's an inherent contradiction and complexity in the sense that China's integrated itself as part of its overall strategy into a global capitalist economy. It sells things where it can make money. That includes participating in the arms trade. That includes, China doesn't impose unilateral sanctions on countries. China only participates in sanctions that are legal, which means they've been approved by the UN Security Council. So that means that China, for example, doesn't impose sanctions on Israel, whereas we might all like it to. But China does that on the basis of having one law and one set of rules for all countries. China doesn't impose unilateral sanctions because China tries to adhere to international law, and because it wouldn't have a basis for criticizing and condemning the US's imposition of unilateral sanctions on Russia, on Cuba, on Venezuela, on Nicaragua, on Ethiopia, on Eritrea, on Zimbabwe, and so on and so forth. If China also was able to kind of pick and choose which country it imposed sanctions on. So, China's in a very kind of contradictory position where, on the one hand, it wants to play a progressive role in the world. On the other hand, it's a very important part of its strategy that it adheres to and promotes international law and the kind of international system based on the United Nations and the United Nations Charter. In terms of Cuba, someone can say that China doesn't help Cuba out of goodwill, but the point is, China doesn't have to do what it's doing in Cuba. China doesn't have to invest in Cuba. China doesn't have to be working on 100 renewable energy projects with Cuba. Other countries aren't, and as far as I can tell, I've got very close relations with the Cuban ambassador in London. She's a big friend of China and is very appreciative of China's support. And this is support that kind of comes in spite of the Sino-Soviet split. And Cuba and China had almost no relations in the 70s and 80s. They re-established relations after the fall of the Soviet Union and at the start of the special period in Cuba, which was an extremely difficult time. The city of Beijing actually sent for free 1 million bicycles to the city of Havana at a time when Havana was suffering a massive petrol crisis. Like, it didn't have, because to a significant degree, Cuba's economy was based on receiving these massive donations of oil from the Soviet Union at solidarity prices, and then using some of the oil for themselves and then selling the rest at global market prices and pocketing the change. All of a sudden the Soviet Union disappeared and they had this massive energy crisis, and China reached out very early on, and one of the things they did was to just gift 1 million bicycles. And the other thing, that China has been criticized by quite a few people, including quite a few comrades of mine and people that I work with, that it doesn't do enough to help Cuba because Cuba's in dire straits. Which is, on the one hand, it's a fair enough critique. Countering that, Cuba's life expectancy and level of development and per capita income is around the same as that of China. It's not about China being a much more advanced country that can kind of display its largesse to smaller and less developed countries. There's provinces in China, say Qinghai or Tibet or Inner Mongolia, which have got a lower level of development than that of Cuba. So, from the Chinese people's point of view, they would see, a huge diversion of resources to Cuba as being a bit of a betrayal of their own people. They want their own provinces, poorer provinces in the western centre of the country, to be raised up to the level of the eastern and southern provinces. So, these things aren't simple. Could China do more for Cuba and other socialist countries? Yes, it could. But does it do a lot? Yes, it does. And is what it does very much appreciated by the Cubans? Yes, it is. And the other thing is that China is not looking to put itself in the position that the Soviet Union was in, where, Soviet Union engaged in incredible solidarity with the socialist countries and with other progressive countries and with national liberation movements. But in doing so, by the late 70s, the Soviet Union was spending 25% of its GDP on supporting other countries, to the point where a lot of people were complaining, we don't have an apartment. We're sharing an apartment with 3 different families. We don't have good food on the table. People are not living good lives. But we're giving all of this money to Vietnam. We're giving all of this money to Ethiopia, and so on and so forth. And that is not the way China is developing its foreign policy. It's not setting itself up as the leader of the socialist world in that way. However, China does have the view that through building a multipolar system, through engaging in a non-hegemonic and non-imperialistic and non-dominating way with the countries of the world, through establishing investment, through things like the Belt and Road Initiative, through things like the Global Development Initiative, and so on and so forth, whereby they are helping countries around the world to break out of underdevelopment and to modernize themselves and to improve their living standards and to grow their strength. That means they're helping countries of the world to assert their sovereignty and to stand up for themselves and stand on their own 2 feet without the need for charity and without the need to be to rely on solidarity to the extent that so many countries did in the period of the Cold War and in the period of the Soviet Union's leadership of the socialist world. So, they're playing the game in a slightly different way, but I think you could ask the people of any socialist country or any progressive country of the global south, do they appreciate and do they value the role that China plays? Is China playing a net positive role? And is China helping them to break out of development without imposing hegemonism on them? I think, almost universally they would say that is the case.
Thanks very much, Carlos. One very minor point I would say is, as well, just on that last one that came to my mind, is that I think when talking about China's self-interest, we also have to reflect that China is 1.3 billion people, so the maths might be a bit off. What's that? A fifth of the world?
Yeah.
So even still, even if it is just the self-interest of the Chinese people, it's still the self-interest of a substantial amount of the people of the whole world. So I think that's something that the Chinese also take into mind when they say that as long as socialism exists in China, socialism will exist in the world. I think it's a quote the Chinese leadership have used on a few occasions. So unfortunately we can't take any more questions because Aaron told me not to, so director complaints at him. But personally I like to stay positive, and I think China has done one thing, it's to keep us aware that there is still the red flag flying, that also it's getting much better in terms of the global balance of forces. It's debatable, but I suppose we'll finish up with the immortal quote of Father Ted, which is Chinese great bunch of lads. So we'll finish up there, so thanks a million again, Carlos.